Good evening. Good evening. I'm Paul McLean, Associate Director of Pastoral Care here at Calvary. Welcome to Dialogue, a podcast of the Lenten Preaching Series recorded live here at Calvary Episcopal Church in Memphis. And tonight my guest is Dr. Jemar Tisby, who's a professor, historian, author, preacher, teacher, father, and I learned this afternoon, Formula One racing fan.
There you go.
Jemar, welcome back to Calvary. When you and I first met 5 years ago, you were at that time a PhD student in history at my alma mater, Ole Miss, studying with Dr. Noel Wilson, who's a Calvaryite.
That's right.
Yeah. And she spoke so highly of you, and I know was supportive of you on your journey and vice versa. And you made a transition a couple of years ago from the Arkansas-Mississippi Delta, from your time at Ole Miss, to teaching, being a professor at Simmons College in Kentucky. Tell us what that move's been like for you and your family, and how has it informed your work and shaped your spiritual journey?
Fall of 2022, I get a call out of the blue that it's from a professor at Simmons, and then he puts me in touch with the college president of Simmons, which is a historically black college, HBCU, founded in 1879 by a group of Black Baptist ministers. It's private, it's faith-based, and they said, we've got a spot for you if you're interested. And I said, whoa. I do a lot more than teach. Would that be okay? So it's been a great arrangement where I get to teach African American history and other related classes, but I also get to do more public-facing work. And we get to live in Louisville, Kentucky, which is how they told me to say it. But I have heard it at least half a dozen different pronunciations, even from folks who live in the city. But it's been a great transition, wonderful riverfront, great culinary scene. I'm all about the food. I found the best desserts there. There's this place that makes a caramel apple pie with a layer of caramel icing on top of the pie with a scoop of ice cream. It's dangerous, is what it is. It's dangerous.
Well, tell us what are on the minds of your students these days? What are they like, and what are you learning from them, and vice versa? And in lieu of in line with your sermon today, how are you helping them find their spiritual gifts and they you?
Thank you. The students obviously are the best part of teaching, and young people are going to be young people, although we have what they call non-traditional student population. So that means a lot of adults who are coming back to school and finishing up. So it's an interesting generational mix. I was in class one day, one of my students comes in beaming, and I'm like, what are you so happy about? She said, I celebrated my retirement today from 40 years at this company. It's like, all right, you've been there almost longer than I've been alive. That's cool. And so that's been a great experience. It was really interesting in the lead up to the 2024 presidential election because I was trying to help students understand the stakes and the gravity of what was coming. And a couple got it, but first of all, it's partly a young people thing of just being in a different stage of life, but also I don't think we can overestimate the amount of disengagement from some of the political atmosphere there is, and therefore the constant need to talk about basic civic participation, basic civic processes, how things work, not just at the federal level, but the state and local level. At the same time, there's some exposure, particularly with students who are a little bit older, so I'm talking, early 20s, because they would have been very cognizant of what was going on with Breonna Taylor. That happened in Louisville. Of course, she's murdered in a no-knock raid in 2020. I had the great honor, if you look in the endorsements for the Spirit of Justice, Tamika Palmer, Breonna Taylor's mother, endorsed the book, The Spirit of Justice. And so I've gotten to know her a little bit, but it just brings a human perspective to all of these anti-Black police brutality issues that we see on the news. There's actual real people involved.
Absolutely. And obviously, as a teacher, the word history itself implies a male-centered story, his story. And we see that in the Bible, we see that in our history textbooks. And in your latest book, The Spirit of Justice, you just mentioned True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. You share the struggles of more women than men in this book.
Yeah,
and
2 women, 1 man on the cover.
That's right, and that's reflected throughout the book. And I found that striking. What prompted you to highlight the stories of women in this book?
First of all, I like quizzing people on who's on the cover. And there's a lot of people who don't know any of them. The most recognizable is in the center, Coretta Scott King. And then almost no one knows who's on the side. So to her left, the other woman is Anna Murray Douglas, who was the spouse of Frederick Douglass, helped him escape. There would be no Frederick Douglass as we know him without Anna Murray Douglass, his wife of 40 years. And then on the right, the only male on the cover is a man named Reverend Elias Camp Morris, E.C. Morris. He was the first president of the National Baptist Convention, USA, Inc., which is the largest religious body of African Americans in the country. And from 1895, its inception, until 1922, his death, he was the first president of it. And his church, Centennial Baptist Church, was in the same town I used to live in Helena, Arkansas, in the Delta. Mm-hmm. So, to your question around representation of women, first of all, as many academic disciplines, it's been male-dominated for a long time, and therefore the stories have been male-dominated. And the reality is women were at the forefront of every phase of the Black freedom struggle in the country, in the nation's history. And so throughout every chapter, I try to have at least 50-50 representation to show the ways that women led the movement. They were not just participants or foot soldiers, they were actually architects of the movement. And they also faced the dual issues of racism and sexism. So the ways they've had to maneuver were different than men had to maneuver. Of course, exposed to sexual exploitation, but also child rearing, and as they're thinking of freedom, how do we care for children and protect them at the same time?
Wow. There was one particular woman that really inspired the title of the book, and was your inspiration, and you delve into very deeply in your first and last chapters of the book, and her name Merle Evers Williams.
Yes.
Tell us about her and why her story was so significant to you.
It was one of those God moments. It was 2017, the grand opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, which was a very contentious affair. First of all, there was the question of, would Mississippi get the history right? Or would they whitewash it? Thankfully, there were some really great historians and community members involved, and so they did the history well. They told an honest story. But also, it was shrouded because the governor at the time, Phil Bryant, had invited the president at the time, Donald Trump, to come be part of the grand opening. And the dissonance there. So there were several dignitaries who had been invited to the grand opening ceremonies who pulled out, including John Lewis, the congressperson, as well as Benny Thompson, who represented the district, and then later headed up the January 6th commission in Congress. They pulled out, as well as some others, but Merle Evers Williams still came. And so she got a private tour of the museum, and it didn't occur to me until later that the museum has, so Merle Evers is the widow of Medgar Evers, who was assassinated in front of their home in 1963 in Jackson. And it didn't occur to me till later that the museum has the exact rifle used to assassinate her husband. And so she was just steps away from the weapon that changed her life and traumatized their family. And after that, she gives this nationally televised, inspiring speech. And then after that, there's this private press conference that I was fortunate enough to be able to attend. Journalists asked her, how do race relations, the racial landscape now in the 21st century compared to 1950s and 60s. And she said some sobering words. She's like, I'm seeing things now that I hoped I'd never see. And she said, I don't mind confessing to you that I'm a bit weary at this point, which was such an understatement. This was 2017 and she's in her mid-80s. And she should be kicking back with her feet up, drinking a drink with an umbrella in it and enjoying, right? But instead she says this, and it helped inspire the book. But it's something about the spirit of justice that raises up like a war horse, that horse that stands with its back sunk in and hears that bell. I like to say, the bell of freedom. And all of a sudden, it becomes straight and the back becomes stiff and you become determined all over again. Wow. And I thought about that. And the fact that this woman in her 9th decade of life, whose husband had been stolen from her in the most violent of ways, she's the one who goes out in front of their house and sees his bloody body. And after all of that, she contemplated suicide, she had a miscarriage, and somehow she found a way to still go on. Moves her family to California, finishes college, which she had to quit when she got married, becomes a very high-level official in cities in Southern California, comes back to the NAACP, which Medgar Evers worked for in the mid-90s, and basically brings it back from the brink of bankruptcy and helps restore its national reputation, gives a prayer at Obama's inauguration, the first non-ordained person to do that, and is still saying, there's something about the spirit of justice that makes you determined all over again. And I'm like, we don't have the luxury of giving up. Mm-hmm. Yeah. When people like Myrlie Evers are still alive and still willing to fight.
Yeah. I think that's a commonality in the stories you present, is this perseverance. We got to keep on keeping on.
I always get, in my head, the words confused of the subtitle. It says, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. And I often want to say true stories of faith, race, and resilience, because that's also one of the characteristics there. And by the way, it's always fun choosing a book title. I knew what the title itself would be. That phrase I thought was so powerful, the spirit of justice. But if you look at early versions of the cover online, there's a difference between what's actually printed on the cover. So it used to just be Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. We added the true part later because we wanted folks to know this ain't made up stuff. These are real people, regular, ordinary people who, because of the spirit of justice, which is that spirit that says, I am made in the image of God, and I do not deserve to be treated this way. Because of that, they rose up and they resisted in manyfold ways. And we wanted to emphasize the true aspect of it because I wanted it to be inspiring. If you've read my first book, The Color of Compromise, in a nutshell, that's about white Christians behaving badly around race. The spirit of justice is sort of the counterpart, where instead of compromise with racism and complicity with racism, there's courageous confrontation with racism.
Yeah, and what's interesting about the true stories is you bring truth and light to these stories of women and others, some that we were not familiar with.
Oh, yeah.
But then you took on a whole chapter on Martin Luther King, someone we're probably over-familiar with or think we're over-familiar with. We've heard so many quotes and so many things about Martin Luther King that we've almost lost sight of who he was as a person.
Absolutely.
And you write in that chapter, you invite us to get beyond what you call the quotable king. Tell us what you mean by that.
So I'll first go back a little bit, and I should mention there's an entire chapter on black women of the civil rights movement. To go back to the really inexcusable sort of overlooking and underplaying the role of women in the movement overall and of black women specifically. So following that chapter on MLK, there's an entire chapter just on black women in the movement. But it's often the figures that we are most familiar with who we actually know the least. And MLK is one of those people whose his history has morphed into mythology. And so I wanted to write a chapter because you really can't think about the black freedom struggle without thinking about MLK. But I didn't want to miss the opportunity to offer, if not a corrective, then some more robust information. And one of the things that I do in that chapter, I begin with MLK the Christian. Even historians, a lot of times, will emphasize the public activism part of it without truly giving due credit to the faith that animated his activism. So I talk about the fact that, first of all, King is brilliant. He starts college at Morehouse at the age of 15. What were you doing when you were 15? Certainly not taking college courses. And so he graduates by the time he's 19, goes straight from there to Crozier and gets a master's degree, goes straight from there to Boston University School of Theology, gets his PhD by the time he's 25. And his goal is to be a local church minister. He always had his eye toward social activism, but he wanted to be like his mentors, like Benjamin Mays, and just be this sort of pastor scholar. He loved books, he loved reading, he loved thinking. Until December 1955, when he sort of thrust to the forefront of the Montgomery bus boycott through his eloquence. I was just in Montgomery with a civil rights tour, and he gave his first civil rights speech at a place called Holt Street Baptist Church. And they were just looking for somebody who was relatively fresh, who didn't raise the ire of the local folks. And they're like, we got this new young preacher, I think his name is King. Would you say some words? And it was so powerful that it's like, he's the guy. Which, by the way, if you know anything about like the Black Baptist church tradition, if you have not paid your dues, it's very unlikely that you will get any place of prominence. He was so eloquent, spirit-filled, I would say, and powerful, that he was able to somehow circumvent all of the sit down, young man, wait your turn stuff that happens in churches. And I wanted folks to realize, King is a Christian, especially against a lot of fundamentalist Christians who will discredit him because he's too liberal. His theology is too progressive. Or they'll look at his seminary papers and they'll say he was a heretic, right? And again, in Montgomery, that was his first pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, right? And there was a parsonage there where he lived. And we went and we stood in front of King's first home with Coretta, where they had their first children, that was also bombed. And there's a plaque on the front porch. They preserved the house. There's a plaque on the front porch where the bomb landed. And I relate in the book about MLK's kitchen table moment. And I say this story because we got to know there's like a genuine personal conversion and relationship here with King. So this is January 1956. We're about a month into the bus boycott. He's already getting death threats constantly. He gets home late one night from an organizing meeting. He gets another death threat. And he's thinking about his wife and his newborn child. And he goes to the kitchen, makes himself a cup of coffee, and he has a little talk with Jesus. And he relates this later in his writings. And he basically says, I had to make my faith my own. My mother's faith wasn't going to do it. My father's faith wasn't going to do it. I had to come to know Jesus for myself. This God that I'd been raised learning about had to be real to me. And he says he heard a voice say, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, and keep going. And in that moment, he took a leap of faith and decided to keep going. But it was that very real, personal sort of crisis of faith in the crucible of persecution and death threats that he said, all right, this God thing is real, and I'm going to live like it.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. And I've been reading the recent biography of Dr. King by Jonathan Eig, and I shared with a fellow clergy person that I was reading this book, and she said, I've got that book, but I'm not sure I want to read it, because I understand it is actually in spots shows Dr. King's frailties, human frailties, as well as the whole complexity of his life story. Really takes him down. You talk about beyond the quotes. This takes him beyond the pedestal. And I wondered how you feel about, now that we obviously know more about his life story, both the complexities, maybe some really great complexities of that, and as well as some human frailties of people that were hurt by him. But beyond that, as a historian, a number of historical figures, we can look at our biblical tradition, King David, who wrote the Psalms, and we credit so much to him, but yet we see his human frailties in the Bathsheba story, Uriah that died. How do you as a historian deal with presenting the truth about these figures in a way that we honor what things that honor their roles in the tradition, while also realizing that there were human frailties and real people were hurt?
Well, this question specifically about King is more relevant than maybe many of us realize, because they're set to release some records from the FBI. Right. That's what this administration has said. And as soon as they announced it, Bernice King, the youngest daughter of MLK and Coretta, she's like, listen, at least do us the courtesy of letting us read it first, which we're still not sure they'll do. It's not as if they have any sort of empathy, right? So I think that's one important thing, is that, a figure like MLK in some sense feels like he belongs to all of us, but there was a family there that he truly does belong to. Sure. And speaking of him as if that's true, and these folks are still alive, that's first and foremost. Secondly, history and studying history is a profoundly humanizing discipline, because you come to learn that there's light and dark in every person and in every movement, right? So I don't care if it's slaveholders who were very affectionate to their family, their biological family, who were white, or they donated to certain causes, or they built libraries, or whatever it might be, and they enslaved people, or they preached powerful sermons that, if you didn't know they enslaved people, would be transformative, right? Or figures who we look as mainly good, like MLK, and realizing, he wasn't Jesus, and therefore was not sinless. So that's part of what history and studying history teaches you. There's nobody who's unassailable. And so when you look at King, he's still very much a Black Baptist preacher, very patriarchal, wanted Coretta to stay home and raise the kids and look good on his arm a lot of times. And of course, she's a brilliant woman who I profile in the book. She graduates valedictorian of her class. She's hearing about nonviolence before he does. She thought he was, when they first met, he was too short and too slick, Wasn't impressed with him that much. And she really shapes a lot of his thinking as well. And she goes on to be a global human rights activist. She's working in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, nuclear disarmament, all of this stuff, so in her own right. And we don't get a lot of that during the movement. And part of that's MLK and how they were relating. So I think it's not everyone's going to get it. There are people out there who will use information like in Eig's biography or whatever comes out in these FBI records to not just humanize King, but dehumanize King, and say they would love nothing more than to take sort of the crown jewel of the historical civil rights movement as a person and crush it, right? To crush our hope, partially. But I think for those of us who have some wisdom around this, we'll see that, for me, as I looked at this history, it actually makes his story more inspiring in a way, because there was nothing incredibly special about him in terms of morality or ethic. He was an ordinary person, extraordinary gifts for sure, but struggled with fear, struggled with inconsistency. His thought evolved over time. And to me, that means, okay, he wasn't this unattainable mythological figure that we can only look up at and admire. He's on our level in a certain sense. And that actually, to me, adds to the remarkableness of what he was able to do and inspires me to try to follow his example.
We did the same thing in a lot of ways with Mother Teresa in terms of her myth and her impact. You know, she and Dr. King probably were regarded as two of the most saintly figures of our recent time. And when it was revealed that her journals revealed that most of her life she spent in doubt, was just phenomenal. And to me, it made her more accessible.
That's right. More accessible.
And a more living, breathing saint, for lack of a better word, a living, breathing human being that I can relate to.
And I'll say it's a problem if our heroes can only be perfect in order to be a hero, right? I think there are certainly people who model good behavior that we should emulate. That doesn't mean that they did it in every part of their lives or in every instance. But that also doesn't mean we can't still learn from them, look up to them, and admire them. And, you know, this is part of reading our Bibles well, because unless you're talking about Jesus, every single person you're reading about has issues. And B, we can learn from the Black freedom struggle and the Black Christian tradition, because fundamentally what Black folks have had to do throughout our history in North America is eat the meat and spit out the bones. I mean, that's how we have Black Christians, learning it from white enslavers. We're like, there's something here, but I'm going to take that part where you said I am created by God to be enslaved to you, and chuck that part out, and listen to the God who still speaks through the gospel, even though it's through a corrupted lens that you're bringing.
And Jemar, you do a wonderful job, and especially the Color of Compromise, of sharing the story of how there were so many moments that the Christian church could have gone a different direction. And so a few moments in the spirit that almost did, and almost did even in the Continental Congress as a political structure. Jefferson had this paragraph about abolishing slavery that the Southern delegation walked out. And in order to, the compromise was, we keep that in and we deal with it later.
Right. There was an early draft of the Declaration of Independence that wanted to indict King George, and it was an anti-slavery, or at least an anti-slave trade paragraph that Jefferson, of all people, wrote. Talk about eating the meat and spitting out the bones. But they nixed that paragraph because Southern plantation owners, there were politicians as well, they were like, if that's in there, then what does that say about us? Like, they clearly saw the implications and the hypocrisy. So it actually goes against the sort of men of their time argument that I've heard a lot from right-wing Christians, which is, well, you can't be too hard on slave owners. It was just common in the day. They didn't know any different. Everybody was doing it. Well, first of all, I think Black people of the day would beg to differ. And then secondly, if it was so common, like a fish in water, that they didn't notice it, why would they withhold support of the Declaration over this paragraph about slavery? They knew. They knew it indicted them, and they knew what it would mean to write into a founding document this anti-slave trade position, because that would mess with their bottom line.
Yeah. And just a few minutes before our presentation here tonight, Scott Walters and I walked out with Jemar to where we are working on our 87 Adams Slave Market Memorial with the help of some gifted students who grew up in Calvary, among others. And really the help of the whole community. We're engaging the whole city of Memphis in the collaborative conversations. And we want to, obviously you can tell that we want to do this monument memorial right. We want to do it with full honor. And I thought it might be helpful for you to share with us, one of the things you talk about in your first chapter is historical appropriation and what that means, how we as in picking up history can appropriate different things. And tell us what that is, and how can we avoid this in our memorial, but also in general in our lives.
My first book, The Color of Compromise, ticked off a lot of people because it had the receipts about white Christian racism throughout our nation's history. And everybody was in there: Episcopalians, Methodists, Catholics, Baptists, Protestants of all sorts. And the most frequent critique, which was always a bad faith critique, was, well, it's biased. He's only telling the bad parts. What about the good Christians? What about the abolitionists? And by the good Christians, they always meant white Christians. They wanted, counterexamples of white Christians who stood for racial justice in contrast to the vast majority of white Christians who were either complicit or actively involved in racism. So I called their bluff in this book, The Spirit of Justice. And I said, you know what? There were Christians who resisted racism. There weren't many white Christians who resisted racism, but we can talk about the black Christians who did. And crickets so far. None of that chorus of people has responded to the Spirit of Justice. But the reason I talk about historical appropriation, you maybe have heard this term cultural appropriation, where you sort of adopt cultural aesthetics or characteristics without understanding or honoring the culture from whence they came. Mm-hmm. So, just bear with me. Like, white women getting cornrows in their hair without, like, they're just on vacation in Jamaica. It's a cool thing to do. Okay, all right. If you don't understand what's going on there, just Google it. Blackface would be an egregious example. Or you remember when Democratic members of Congress, I think it was 2020 or 21, put on kente cloth in the Capitol building and like knelt in solidarity. It's like, but I mean, really? Is that something you really understand? So some of it can be sort of innocuous, some of it's more pernicious, but it's the idea that you're adopting this stuff without really understanding what it took to develop it. And in the same way, I think we can have historical appropriation, particularly for white Christians, which is what I would characterize as we look at these positive counterexamples of Christians standing up for racial justice. And we say, see, that's who we are. But your tradition, your church, your faith community wasn't standing in solidarity with these folks. In fact, they may have even opposed them. But because they're also Christian, you take that as the dominant narrative. And the racist part is the exception. Now, I think there's something positive here, where if it is Christian, then there's a sense in which it's part of the entire family tree. And I do want white Christians to know that there are white Christians who were a hyper minority, but who stood up against racism, and you can claim that. But also, black Christians are in the family too. And you can claim that as part of the Christian tradition, but you have to not just appropriate that history, you have to recognize that probably your branch of the family tree in Christianity was not standing up for racial justice, but was part of the reason why black Christians needed to work so hard and sacrifice so much. I don't know if that's making sense to people. If it ain't, just read the book. I'm baiting you in.
That's right.
To getting it for yourself. I just didn't want folk to take credit for the righteous actions of other Christians when they or their tradition were never part of it. Claim it, but understand that they were facing great opposition, maybe even from your own tradition. So with humility.
Exactly. Humility, I think, is the key. And while we're on the book selling theme, I wanted to share that Jemar also wrote 3 children's books recently. And I wanted you to tell us about what inspired you to write these children's books, and what was it like to present these complex stories to children without dumbing them down?
So the Spirit of Justice is really kind of 3 for 1. You get this adult version. There's a young reader's version for tweens, 8 to 12-ish. And then there's a picture book, my very first picture book for kids 4 to 7. They're gorgeous. We have them back at the table. Don't take my word for it. But cool story about the picture book. First of all, the illustrator we have is a woman of color. She's just magnificent artist. Even without opening the book, you can just frame the pictures. But there's another person on there. It says Jemar Tisby with Malcolm Newsome. And I don't know if any of y'all had a best friend growing up, but, you know, what would you do with your best friend? You would talk a lot, play video games, ride bikes, whatever you did, right? Never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined co-writing a children's book with my childhood best friend, Malcolm Newsome. So we met in 5th grade, and we were attached at the hip through 12th grade. I mean, like, not just, oh yeah, we know each other. Like, you did not mention Malcolm without saying Jemar, or Jemar without saying Malcolm. And so he's like a computer programmer, but he does children's book writing on the side. And it's not a foregone conclusion. The publisher asked if I had anyone in mind who could help me adapt this for children, and I recommended him, but there's a vetting process that he has to go, and he passed with flying colors. So I got to co-author my first picture book with my childhood best friend. But to your question, the picture book in particular is not something you can hand to a 5 or 6-year-old and say, go and read it and tell me what you think. As adults, as parents, as guardians, you got to sit down with them and walk through it, because it doesn't pull punches. We go from the west coast of Africa to the slave ships, to the slave auction, to the Declaration, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness is in there, to the Civil War, to segregation, on up to the present day and the Black Lives Matter movement. It's all in there. And it does take unpacking. What I tell folks is, let this be an introduction, and let this be a nudge. So a nudge to get the conversation going probably sooner than you want. But I say, you know, the race talk is a lot like the sex talk. They're gonna learn it somewhere. So it may as well be from the people who care about them most. And the more we can do that early on, the better equipped they are as they grow up. So this book gives you a little bit of content to nudge you and start the conversation. And I emphasize it's a start of a conversation, because it's never just one and done. What it does is it says this is a safe topic for us to talk about. And that's a book you could read again and again and again and get to the layers. And so the not dumbing down part, it was actually not hard, because you just go through the history. You just tell the story. And the hard parts are there. But the emphasis in the picture book, every couple of pages, it says, I am the Spirit of Justice. And it's pictured as a wind, like the Holy Spirit blowing throughout time, inspiring resistance in every era.
That's great. And you told us that you actually went to your 12-year-old son's classroom,
yes,
and with your book, and tell
the
us
whole school.
What was the response there, the kids and the teachers?
Gosh. I don't know what they put in the water there, but they were so attentive, so respectful, such great questions. And then, you know, your parent comes to your middle school, you might be like, oh gosh, Dad is here. He was proud. He took a picture with me and everything in front of the students. It was great. So that was an absolute highlight of the experience.
Well, we're being in Memphis. We can't. One of our legendary figures here, Ida B. Wells Barnett. We talked a little bit about at lunch about her investigative journalism that uncovered lynchings here, the People's Grocery lynching, others that really brought exposure to the world back in the 1890s and that time frame. And we talked about the need for investigative journalism today for racial justice, particularly as it uncovers criminal justice, incarceration, mass incarceration, and environmental justice, lots of other areas too. And we talked. There seems to be a dearth of investigative reporting in all areas right now. But what do you see on the horizon? Do you see hope there, and for a new Ida B. Wells folks to emerge?
Well, y'all got one right here in Memphis, Wendy Thomas, and her journalistic endeavors. So it's close to home. Memphis is such an epicenter for a lot of this, and a great place where you can learn about investigative journalism. I mean, Ida B. Wells has a direct connection here. You should definitely know that story. It's something to be proud of. There are other efforts going on. The Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting has started by Jerry Mitchell, who's an investigative journalist. He's the one who, Medgar Evers' killer, there was a court case, he was acquitted. There was another court case, he got off. And it wasn't until 30 years later that he was finally convicted. And it was because of new evidence brought through the investigative journalistic efforts of the guy named Jerry Mitchell. So Jerry Mitchell's in Mississippi. He started this MCIR, and they partnered with, I believe, Mississippi Today. And so that's going on even now. And they're the ones, if you've heard of this story about this, it's called the Goon Squad. It is horrific. These group of law enforcement officers in central Mississippi near Jackson who literally torture people, illegal, all of it, and we've got recordings and everything. They broke the story about the Goon Squad, and they were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize for that. And so it's ongoing. People like Nicole Hannah-Jones with the 1619 Project, she did something very, in hindsight it seems obvious, but it was incredibly creative and subversive. Instead of 1776 and the Declaration of Independence as the birth of our nation, or its founding, its origin story, what if it was 1619 when the first enslaved Africans arrived at Point Comfort in British colonial Virginia? And so what if slavery is the real genesis of this nation and not this lauded Declaration of Independence and all these lofty ideals, right? And because of that, it sparked this massive backlash to the point where Trump in his first presidency established the 1776 Commission, which is, propagandist history, right? And he's going to bring it back because 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration. And there's going to be so much nationalist propaganda around that studying accurate history brought to the fore by experts is going to be an even more urgent matter, because that's the kind of history that's being whitewashed right now.
I think I got time for one more before we'll open it up to the audience. Tell us about your plans for your next two books.
Well, I can't say too much about the second one, but the next one is going to be my first memoir, and it's called Notes from an Evangelical Reject. And I'm talking about the fact that I came to faith in a white evangelical, seeker-sensitive church context. And that was really my first personal experience with Christianity. And interestingly, what I'm saying in the book, I went through a lot of backlash and whatnot as I started doing public justice work. But in the beginning, when I was a new Christian, as a teenager and a college student, it was really because of a sense of community that I found among evangelicals that it was so stark to me that race was such a barrier. And so it's in an interesting way, not because I had such a negative experience in the beginning with community and evangelicals. It was because I had such a positive experience in the beginning that there was this dissonance when it came to talking about racial justice and everything that came with this. So I'm just trying to unpack that story in the hopes that it would help folks feel not so alone, but also give some lessons learned from that experience.
Yeah. We look forward to it. Well, with that, I'd love to turn it over. We're going to turn off the, I guess, the live streams to give people an opportunity to speak freely for questions, and for Jemar.